Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Feeling a little thrown off by a different setup than usual, but hopefully all is well. In fact, let me get the chat up. Would love it if you could just confirm that audio and video are looking okay. Audio is sounding okay, video is looking okay, all that stuff. I'll get started in a moment. Going to stall a little bit. Usually there's an intro video and all that gives people time. And just explain what's going on, which is that we had quite a storm about 2 weeks ago, and a lightning bolt hit on our land, fried my two internet modems, destroyed a Mac, messed up the Mac I use for broadcasting the show, which is in the shop right now. So I'm actually using a different Mac and just kind of throwing things together using StreamYard. Not my usual setup, no fancy intro, anything like that. But the great content will still be coming. Okay, so let's see, can you hear me? Hoping for a confirmation from someone watching if you get a chance in the chat on YouTube. And also, it's YouTube only this time because I realize I got to have some expensive subscription to StreamYard if I'm going to do more than one output destination. Anyway, it'll all be back to normal next week. I should get my Mac back from the shop tomorrow, I think. Okay, so what is this? This is a series. This is number 3 in the series. If you go to the video description, thank you, John. If you go to the video description on YouTube, you will see the link to the playlist. And you can catch up with ones you missed and watch for new episodes as they get added. I thought it'd be nice to focus on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Seems very relevant with recent events in Gaza. And I'm starting with what I'm thinking of as the 101 material. And then I'm hoping some friends will come along later to let us go a little bit deeper. The 101 material is the Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. It's a very academic, balanced treatment. And yet, I found it quite interesting. I haven't found it boring at all, perhaps because I've seen how effective the Israel Lobby has been in my lifetime. One of the things I learned, and I wanted to kind of focus on today, is the fact that it wasn't always like this. There wasn't an Israel Lobby from the 1776. When did it start? When did this Israel Lobby start? When did it become really effective? Because it could have been around, not doing much or not making much of a difference, and in fact that's the case. When did it really become a force to reckon with in U.S. politics? Well, Mearsheimer and Walt are going to give us the answers today. Anything else I should do before we get into the content, the main content? Would appreciate support through Subscribestar. There's a link in the show description. Most people subscribe for a mere $5 a month, but number of people do that, and it starts to add up and let me pay for the nice thumbnails and stuff like that, and books I buy and so forth. So support is very much appreciated. And I guess that's it. Let's go. All right. So we're going to I'm going to try to cover 3 chapters today. Is that crazy? It's probably crazy, but let's try. Because what ties these all together is that it really introduces us to the Israel Lobby. Before we were getting the previous episodes, we were talking about the sort of the case for the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Is Israel a strategic asset or is it a liability? A bit on the history of Israel. What are the different stories that are told, the narratives that are told about the origins of the state, how the state's behaved, the wars that have happened, all that kind of stuff. We covered that before. But these 3 chapters really introduce us to the lobby itself, and then the rest, the balance of the other half of the book is the lobby in action. But I thought today's episode was worthy of calling the Israel lobby, because here we get introduced to the lobby. That it's not about the Israel lobby and a certain event. This is about the lobby. This is a deep dive on the lobby itself, when it started, how it functions, where it has more influence, where it has less influence, so on and so forth. Okay. How's everything looking? Good? Yeah. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Sorry. I was going to try this to make it bigger. Let's see what we think of that. Can I move that? Solo layout. What is that? Oh, no, it's not what I want. Sorry. Not used to, haven't been using StreamYard for a while. Okay, let's try that. Blocks a little bit of the text, but okay. So what is the Israel lobby? So the influence of the Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy merits the same scrutiny as the impact of energy interests on environmental regulations, or the role of pharmaceutical companies in shaping policy on prescription drugs. We believe the activities of the groups and individuals who make up the lobby are the main reason why the United States pursues policies in the Middle East that make little sense on either strategic or moral grounds. Now, this is actually a strong thesis. That is, there are other interpretations that are put forward. The United States is in the Middle East for oil. The United States is in the Middle East driven by energy companies. That's closely related to the oil thing, right? The United States is in the Middle East because it's just in the strategic interest of the United States. That's mostly been addressed in previous episodes. They are going to try to shoot down these other explanations in favor of their explanation that the U.S. lobby is, the influence of the U.S. lobby is the main reason that the United States does what it does in the Middle East. Further, they argue, not only is it the the Israel lobby that's having this influence, but they argue that most of the policies the Israel lobby advocates are not in America's or Israel's interest. And both countries would be better off if the United States adopted a different approach. Okay, so okay, sorry, how do I do this? I'm just gonna have to have the mouse on the screen. Okay. So this chapter identifies the central components of the Israel lobby and describes how it has evolved over time. We also discuss why it has become so influential, especially when compared to potential competitors like the Arab lobby and the oil lobby. You don't hear much about the Arab lobby. There is one. It just doesn't do much, but as we'll see. The following chapters describe the different strategies that have made it such a powerful interest group and a remarkably effective player in the making of U.S. Middle East policy. Okay, so first of all, what do they mean when they say the Israel lobby? Why do they use those words? We use Israel lobby as a convenient shorthand for the loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively work to shape U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. The lobby is not a single unified movement with a central leadership, however, and the individuals and groups that make up this broad coalition sometimes disagree on specific policy issues. It's not a cabal, it's not a conspiracy. On the contrary, the organizations and individuals who make up the lobby operate out in the open and in the same way that other interest groups do. There's a little asterisk on that, but mostly agreed. These are organizations, you can look them up, you can see where their headquarters are, you can see who the president of the organizations are. This isn't like underground, right? So one might more accurately double this the pro-Israel community or even the Help Israel movement, because the range of activities the different groups undertake goes beyond simple lobbying, but they stick with the Israel lobby along the same lines that people talk about the farm lobby, the insurance lobby, the gun lobby. We know what they mean. It doesn't mean that every part of it is necessarily literally a lobbyist organization, right? But they work together to push for this issue. So that's what they mean by the Israel lobby. Okay, so yeah, they go through some of the organizations involved and so forth, just to emphasize that it's not a centralized hierarchical organization with a defined membership. There's a lot of components to the lobby. So this definition does not mean that every American with a favorable attitude toward Israel is a member of the lobby. To offer a personal illustration, the authors of this book are pro-Israel in the sense that we support its right to exist, admire its many achievements, want its citizens to enjoy secure and prosperous lives, believe that the U.S. should come to Israel's aid if its survival is in danger. But we are obviously not part of the Israel lobby. To be part of the lobby, one has to actively work to move American foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. So they talk about various differences between people in the lobby and say, you can say, hey, no, they're all not cohesive. Look, they disagree on this, they disagree on that. And they say, sure. Sorry, distracted because my wife just reminded me I have a conflict. Okay. Sorry, where am I? Yeah, so you can point to various policy disagreements people have, but despite these differences, each of these individuals believes that the U.S. should give Israel substantial diplomatic, economic, and military support. And here's the key point: even when Israel takes actions the United States opposes. And each part of this lobby has devoted a significant amount of his or her professional life to encouraging this sort of support. So it's this sort of blank check support that they're particularly pointing to. Okay. So now, what about the role of Jewish Americans in all this? The bulk of the lobby, no shocker, is comprised of Jewish Americans who are deeply committed to making sure that U.S. foreign policy advances what they believe to be Israel's interests. No other ethnic group in American history has so extensive an involvement with a foreign nation, according to historian Melvin Urofsky. Steve Rosenthal says, since 1967, that's going to be a key pivot year, by the way, in the story. Since 1967, there has been no other country whose citizens have been as committed to the success of another country as American Jews have been to Israel. Robert Trice described the pro-Israel lobby as comprised of at least 75 separate organizations, mostly Jewish, that actively support most of the actions and policy positions of the Israeli government. Yet, the authors argued the Israel lobby is not synonymous with American Jewry, and Jewish lobby isn't the best term for describing the various individuals and groups that work to foster U.S. support for Israel. Well, why is that? Well, for one thing, about 1/3 of American Jews don't even think Israel is particularly salient, particularly relevant. Some of the individuals and groups that are especially vocal on Israel's behalf, such as the Christian Zionists, are not Jewish. So there's a sort of a Venn diagram, right? And yes, there's a heavy overlap between Jewish Americans and people who would like support the Israel lobby. But it's not one-to-one. There's other people in the Israel lobby that aren't Jewish. And there's Jewish people who aren't in the Israel lobby, either because they don't care, or in some cases, as with some Jewish progressives, for example, they actively oppose a lot of the policies of the Israel lobby, and they actually push in an opposite direction. So it'd be oversimplifying to call the Israel lobby the Jewish lobby. That would kind of hide some of this nuance here. Although many Jews in the U.S. were ambivalent about Zionism during the movement's early years, support grew significantly after Hitler came to power in 1933, and especially after the horrors inflicted on the Jews during World War II became widely known. Relatively few Jews chose to leave the U.S. and move to Israel after its founding in 1948. Now, that's something and he comments, a pattern that Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and other Israeli leaders initially criticized. That's something I hadn't thought much about. Aliyah is what it's called when people go to Israel, Jewish people go to Israel. I hadn't thought about the fact that it's been pretty token, the number of American Jews that have made Aliyah. In fact, a close friend of mine in high school, I think, went there and then came back pretty quickly. So, and as last I knew, is in the United States. So that's interesting. But despite American Jews not en masse moving to Israel, a strong commitment to Israel soon became an important element of identity for many American Jews. So Steve Rosenthal says, to equate Israel with Judaism was a comforting way to avoid the encumbrances of religion by focusing one's Jewishness on a secular state 8,000 miles from home. Synagogues, the new mainstay of American Jewish life in the post-war era, became Israel-centered. Fundraising and lobbying increasingly defined American Jews' relationship to Israel. So this is quite interesting, right? This is sort of saying that there's a hole in, how do I put it? There's sort of a vacuum in Jewish identity that Israel was able to fill. Many American Jews, as you may know, most American Jews are more secular, and yet they still identify as Jews. Well, what does it mean to be Jewish if you're secular? Well, it means you support Israel, right? You follow. I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but you can see how that can work for some people. Yeah, I'm Jewish. I'm pro-Israel. I'm an atheist. But what does it matter? I support Israel, right? So, what are the key organizations? Well, obviously, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AAPAC, the American Jewish Congress, the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, I hope I'm not sure that's exactly right, ZOA, but anyway, it's something like that. The Israel Policy Forum, the IPF, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Americans for a Safe Israel, American Friends of Likud, Merkaz USA, Hadassah, and many others. Right? I mean, they said there were dozens of these, right? In 1992, the American Jewish Yearbook listed more than 80 national organizations specifically devoted to Zionist and pro-Israel activities. And for many others, objectives and activities such as promote Israel's welfare, support for the state of Israel, and promotes understanding of Israel appear with impressive frequency. 51 of the largest and most important organizations come together in the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, whose self-described mission includes forging diverse groups into a unified force for Israel's well-being and working to strengthen and foster the special U.S.-Israel relationship. Okay, I'm not going to try to have everybody keep track of all these organizations, but AIPAC's a key one. And this conference, it's got a long name, right? But we'll just call it the Conference of Presidents. The Conference of Presidents comes up quite a bit. So that seems to be fairly key as well, where they coordinate across a bunch of these organizations together. And then there's think tanks. The Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, I've seen that mentioned quite a bit. The Middle East Forum, WINEP, they didn't tell us. We'll see what that stands for eventually. And of course, just individuals who work in universities and other research organizations. There are dozens of pro-Israel PACs, political action committees, ready to funnel money to pro-Israel political candidates or to candidates whose opponents are deemed either insufficiently supportive of or hostile to Israel. Roughly 36 such pro-Israel PACs, many of them stealth PACs, whose names do not reveal a pro-Israel orientation. These organizations contributed approximately $3 million to congressional candidates in the 2006 midterm election. Now, you may hear $3,000 and think, that's not very much, right? But as people often comment, American politicians come amazingly cheap. So $3 million can go a long way if focused well. And as we'll see, the lobby is quite good at focusing their money and their letter writing and so on and so forth in such a way as that it's highly effective. Okay. In 1997, when Fortune magazine asked members of Congress and their staffs to list the most powerful lobbies in Washington, AIPAC came in second behind the AARP, which is American Association of Retired People. So it's elderly Americans are the top lobby. AIPAC or the Israel lobby is second. But AIPAC's ahead of lobbies that you've probably heard of, like the AFL-CIO, the labor organization, and the NRA, the gun outfit, the biggest gun outfit, right? So they're a major heavy hitter, and you can argue, are they number one, number two, number three? They're up there. They're a big, effective lobby. That's the main point. Okay, I saw that Last of Us. Okay, former Congressman Mervyn Damali once called AIPAC, without question, the most effective lobby in Congress. And the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said in 1991, there's no lobby group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. Okay, so they are now, and as of the 90s or even earlier, an effective lobby, right? And we'll find out sort of how they got there. Okay, so here's where we get into some of the timeline. Groups like AIPAC did not enjoy this influence overnight. During Zionism's early years, even after Israel's founding, and we saw this before, right? The first 20 years of Israel, it didn't have the tight support from the U.S. that it has had since, or that we're used to seeing now. So it wasn't always this way. Excuse me. Sorry. So even after Israel's founding, lobbying on Israel's behalf tended to occur quietly, behind the scenes, usually depended on personal contacts between influential government officials, especially the president, and then a relationship between the president and a small number of Jewish leaders, advisors, Jewish friends, things like that. As an example, Woodrow Wilson's support for the Balfour Declaration in 1917 was due in part to the influence of his Jewish friend, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis and Rabbi Stephen Wise. Similarly, Harry S. Truman's decision to back Israel's creation and to recognize the new state was influenced, though not determined, by intercessions from Jewish friends and advisors. And I'm told a briefcase full of money. But I mean, I think the point here is, yes, there was influence in these sort of moments here through friendships and stuff. But this is quite different than what we think of as the Israel lobby. It's much more dicey, right? It's, what if there's a good Jewish friend of the president he's influenced by and the guy dies or something, or they have a falling out, right? This is too random for the kind of influence the Israel lobby wants. They want much more consistency, right? Than that sort of thing would give them. So AIPAC itself had explicitly Zionist roots. Its founder, I.L. Cy Kennan, was head of the American Zionist Council in 1951, which was a registered foreign lobbying group. Kennan reorganized it as a U.S. lobbying organization, the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, in 53-54, and then it was renamed AIPAC in 1959. And Kennan's rules, these were the way the lobby behaved back then in the 50s, say. Rule number one was, get behind legislation, don't step out in front of it. That is, keep a low profile, right? So now the Israel lobby is loud and proud. It's not subtle. But at that time, they tried to be a bit more behind the scenes. They were worried about a reaction, so forth, right? So Zionist influence increased exponentially during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations because the affluence and influence of Jews in American society had increased, and also because Kennedy and Johnson counted numerous Jews among their close advisors, donors, and personal friends. AIPAC was still a small operation at that time. Not until the mid-60s did overt organized Jewish political activity on behalf of the State of Israel come into its own. The lobby's size, wealth, and influence grew substantially, and here's that pivot point I mentioned, after the Six-Day War in June 1967. So I was born in June 1969. The rise of the Israel lobby as sort of what we know it as today basically occurred more or less during my lifetime. It started 2 years before, but you get the idea. It isn't that much older than I am, the modern Israel lobby. So why was the Six-Day War in 67 such a big deal? That conflict galvanized the American Jewish public like no event since Israel's War of Independence. The sense of pride in new Jews, proud, strong, capable of defending themselves, had an incalculable effect on American Jewry. Jewish Americans lost the sense of fear that had stunted their political will in earlier years. And because Israel was becoming a central focus of Jewish identity, in a world where assimilation was increasingly viable and widespread, there were few reasons not to express that attachment in politics. So it was small, it was quiet, had more to do with certain relationships. Then 1967, Six-Day War hits. We're going to turn this volume up. We're going to be loud and proud. We're going to be organized. We're going to make this happen, right? So there's a real shift about nearly 60 years ago, I guess now, right? Heading towards 60 years. Okay. Right. So the conflicts, the 69 War of Attrition, 69 to 70, October War, 1973, did two things. It reinforced pride in Israel's military prowess. So, more self-confidence, I guess you could say. But it also raised fears about Israel's security. And this reinforced the Israel-centric focus of many Jewish community relations groups. Albert Chernin, the executive director of the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, later renamed the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, expressed this perspective in 1978 when he said that our first priority is Israel, of course, reflecting the complete identity of views of the American Jewish leadership with the concerns of the rank and file. The historian Jack Wertheimer terms this comment a stunning admission that political efforts to shore up Israel superseded all other concerns of Jewish community relations organizations in the United States. Now, I have to say, I feel like I've kind of known about the Israel lobby for decades, right? But there's knowing, and then there's side of knowing in more detail. And sort of one of the shocks to me, I'm used to this picture of the Jewish community as famously debating with each other a lot, having lots of disagreements. I'm surprised at how much unity you find out about reading about this. That basically a lot, not all, there's Orthodox Jews who are not Zionists, for example, but a lot of American Jewish community organizations and synagogues and so forth are 110% pro-Israel. So there's a lot of alignment, a lot more unity than I expected here. As American foreign aid, As American foreign aid to Israel began to exceed private contributions, pro-Israel organizations increasingly focused on political activities intended to preserve or increase U.S. governmental support. This increased effort reflected awareness that backing Israel was costly for the United States, and therefore it had to be justified and defended in the political sphere. This is a callback to everything that we've already covered here about how the argument that there's just a simple overlap between the strategic interest of the U.S. and support for Israel. They sort of tore that apart and they said, no, there isn't, right? So if it was just such an easy overlap, there'd be no big argument to have. You just do what's in your own interest, and that'll be to, back up Israel or whatever. But because these things aren't overlap, they don't align, you have to do a lot of lobbying, a lot of influencing to make the argument and justify the pro-Israel policies, right? What I'm saying is, if there was an easy overlap, almost 100% overlap, hey, it's in the interest of U.S. to support Israel for various strategic reasons of the U.S.'s own, that are specific to the U.S.'s own strategic interests, then there'd be no reason to have an Israel lobby. Just sort of the existence of the Israel lobby shows that it needs, it's needed, right? Under Morris Amate, AIPAC executive director, and his successor Tom Dine, AIPAC was transformed from an intimate, low-budget operation into a large, mass-based organization with a staff of more than 150 employees and an annual budget derived solely from private contributions that went from about $300,000 in 1973 to an estimated 40 to 60 million today. And this book came out in, 2008, I think. 2007, 2008, something like that. Instead of shunning the limelight, as it had done under Kennan, AIPAC increasingly sought to advertise its power. As my friend academic agent says, power wants to be seen. And after the 1967 Six-Day War, increasingly the Israel lobby wanted to be seen, right? It wasn't trying to hide anymore. According to one former staffer, the theory was, no one's scared of you if they don't know about you. So AIPAC and other groups in the lobby did not define their public agenda as humanitarian support for Jews in Israel. Rather, the evolution of the lobby increasingly involved the formulation and promotion of sophisticated arguments about the alignment of America's and Israel's strategic interests and moral values. AIPAC may not have been all that formidable in the early 60s, but by the 80s, it was a Washington powerhouse. Okay, so what's this next section? I'll take a drink. Okay, so unity and diversity, the norm against dissent. So as they're saying, the lobby is not a centralized hierarchical movement. And they talk about some various divisions within the lobby, but they want to emphasize sort of what are they in agreement about. These divisions notwithstanding, the majority of organized groups in the American Jewish community, especially the largest and wealthiest among them, continue to favor steadfast U.S. support for Israel, no matter what policies the Jewish state pursues. As an AIPAC spokesman explained in 2000, we are opposed to linking Israel's aid under any circumstances, because once it starts, it never stops. Linking Israel's aid to good behavior by Israel is what he's talking about. Despite differences on the peace process and related issues, in short, almost every pro-Israel group wants to keep the special relationship intact. A notable exception is Jewish Voice for Peace, the JVP, which has called the U.S. government to suspend military aid to Israel until it ends the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Indeed, given this position, one might argue that the Jewish Voice for Peace is not part of the lobby at all, as they've defined it, right? Which is this sort of blank check for Israel. People pushing for that. So, okay, so what about the relationship with the state of Israel itself? So it says, in domestic areas, we, Israel lobby organizations, made policy, but in Israel affairs, the policy was a given. In reality, the Conference of Presidents was the vehicle through which Israel communicated its policy to the community. So this is the part that makes me feel like Mearsheimer and Walt made a minor error earlier in this chapter where they said, you know, it's not centrally organized and centrally coordinated and all that. I'm like, well, it's not one single organization. I agree with you there. It's a number of organizations. But at least on foreign affairs, Israel affairs, as opposed to domestic U.S. policy, it seems like there is a point of coordination, a single point of coordination. Namely, the state of Israel tells the Conference of Presidents. The presidents go to each of their organizations and say, here's the line, and they all follow the line. So it's a creature of the Israeli state from that point of view, if you follow me. Not that it was created by the Israeli state, but that it follows the commands of the Israeli state. So anyway, I feel like they should have had a footnote earlier there. Okay. It is routine for us to say, this is our policy on a certain issue, but we must check what the Israelis think. We as a community do it all the time. As American Jews, we don't go around saying Israel is wrong about its policies. And I'm reminded, by the way, of how there were communists in various countries, including American communists, who, at least for a while, took their direction from, Stalin. I mean, pretty directly. I mean, they had spies and stuff, or maybe spies is overstating it, but there were lines of communication to Moscow. And if Stalin said, oppose Hitler, then they opposed Hitler. If, as happened in 1939, Stalin allied temporarily with Hitler, then the American communists went soft on Hitler. Then the mid-century Germans attacked the USSR, and suddenly American communists were totally opposed it. So they shifted back and forth as their foreign, master dictated, right? Well, this sounds very similar to me. I have to be frank. Okay. During the crisis preceding the 1967 Six-Day War, the Israeli government instructed its ambassador in Washington to create a public atmosphere that will constitute pressure on the Johnson administration, without it being explicitly clear that we are behind this public campaign. So this is the Israeli government to its ambassador, okay? And so saying, hey, make it look like spontaneous pressure, right? But we don't want to be fingered as the ones behind it. So what did they do? They got sympathetic Americans to write letters, editorials, telegrams, and public statements in a variety of styles. And so what happened? The White House was inundated with letters from citizens calling on the president to stand by Israel. Despite the fissures that have emerged between the Israeli government and some groups within American Jewry, this community has generally accepted the principle that on matters of fundamental security, there ought to be no public criticism of Israel. According to Steve Rosenthal, for millions of American Jews, criticism of Israel was a worse sin than marrying out of the faith. I remember I was quite struck. My father was a missionary to the Jews, and that's why I'm in St. Louis, because he came here to be a missionary to the Jews in 1970. And I was quite struck how in the Jewish community, you could be an atheist and you were still Jewish. No one questioned you were Jewish if you were an atheist, right? And it was like, I thought there was a religious aspect to this. Evidently not. But if you accepted Jesus, you weren't a Jew anymore. Okay, so this sounds like a sort of a similar thing. You think that what matters is, that Jewish people marry other Jewish people or something, right? Or Jewish people of the Jewish faith. No, what's really important is you don't criticize Israeli policy, right? Okay. Even when both leaders and rank and file of important Jewish American organizations have serious reservations about Israeli policy, they rarely call for the U.S. government to put pressure on the Israeli government. Did I say that right? They rarely call for the U.S. government to put pressure on the Israeli government. Okay, so unity, no dissent, right? Let's see, there was a controversy. I wasn't going to get into the details. The Brera controversy. Let's see, what did he do? There was an organization, Brera leaders. They were part of a delegation who met in a private capacity with a group of Palestinian representatives, and there was a big backlash. And so they discussed this in these organizations, and they said, here's the deal. All these organizations reached the same conclusion. American Jews had the right to discuss issues freely, but only within discrete forums outside public view. Now, I've heard of this in the American Black community. They talk about there's certain things we don't say when the mic is on, right? They'll talk about it amongst themselves, but when they're making a public statement, something that could end up in the papers or whatever, they don't talk about certain things, right? Well, that's the same agreement we're seeing here. We're going to be our disagreeing Jewish selves, 3 Jews, 7 opinions or whatever, right? That's all fine privately, but don't do it in public, right? Not about Israel issues. The first principle Goldberg notes was that Israelis were the only ones entitled to decide Israeli policy. And the second was that American Jews should stand publicly united with Israel and air disputes only in private. By the 1970s, total support of Israel had become a requirement of leadership in local Jewish communities throughout America. Why did I highlight this one? I don't know, skipping that one. Okay, let's see. Groups or individuals who criticize Israeli policy or the U.S.-Israel relationship are likely to find it harder to retain support and raise funds within the Jewish community. And efforts to marginalize dissenting Jewish voices continued to this day, and that's illustrated here with a group that tried to kind of stray and got beat down. Okay, so the lobby moves right. This is quite interesting because this is showing how, once there was this consolidated lobby, an agreement, taking orders from Israel on Israel policy, not saying certain, not airing disagreements publicly, all that, right? So that's all in place. And then there's another shift that happens. Most American Jews, I hope I'm not shocking anyone by sharing this news, have long supported liberal or left-wing causes and the Democratic Party, and a majority of them favor a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nonetheless, some of the most important groups in the lobby, including AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents, have become increasingly conservative over time and are now led by hardliners who support the positions of their hawkish counterparts in Israel. Now, some of the uses here of left and right, conservative, liberal, annoy me, but you get the point. Most Jews are like, hey, we should try to have more of strike a deal with the Palestinians, but not the lobby itself. The lobby itself is more extreme, more hawkish, and as we'll see, aligned with a certain contingent in Israel politics. It isn't like representing the whole full spectrum of debate in Israel. It's one part of it. The Six-Day War and its aftermath brought into prominence a group of new Jews drawn disproportionately from hardline Zionist, Orthodox, and neoconservative circles. Their defiance was so strident and their anger so intense that the rest of the Jewish community respectfully stood back and let the new Jews take the lead. The minority was permitted to speak for the mass and become the dominant voice of Jewish politics. So that is a more radical, more warlike, hawkish minority ended up really kind of taking over, okay? In particular, and I don't know why I didn't highlight this part, they're really particularly aligned with the Likud party, which I believe Netanyahu is from the Likud party. So that is what I was saying. In Israel, there's a Likud party and a Labor party, but the Israel lobby in the U.S. is more aligned with the more hardline Likud party. Okay. Smaller conservative groups in the conference decisively outnumber the larger liberal ones and so can neutralize their influence. And that leaves considerable discretion in the hands of Executive Vice Chairman Malcolm Hanlon, who is a longtime supporter of Israel's settler movement and deeply skeptical about the Oslo peace process. So you get the idea. There's a lot of more left-wing Jews in America, right? But it's the right-wing or the hawkish that really end up dominating the Israel lobby. Yeah, Codex, maybe that's a good way to think about it. Conservative only in relation to Israeli politics, not conservative toward anything in the U.S. Yeah, maybe that's why it's bothering me. You have to know what the context in which they mean conservative here. It doesn't mean it's aligned with the American right. America Firsters or something like that. The individuals willing to give the largest amounts to AIPAC and to sympathetic politicians tend to be the most zealous defenders of Israel. AIPAC's top leadership is considerably more hawkish on Middle East issues than are most Jewish Americans. So you got a small minority, you got like neocons, so to speak, and other types like that, who are really influential in the organizations, and the money tends to be more pushing for hardline positions, okay, the big money. AIPAC and other hardline groups, in fact, have occasionally backed more extreme positions than those favored by the Israeli government, right? This is reminding me of how, in an empire, sometimes the edges of the empire will be more radical than the center, The Conference of Presidents never endorsed the Oslo peace process, and AIPAC helped sponsor the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Act, a transparent attempt to disrupt the peace process by requiring the United States to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. which I always thought was really crazy and would never happen. And then Trump did it in his first term. Right? That's what I remember hearing. I think he did it. In addition to this tendency for those with more extreme views to back and dominate key organizations in the lobby, there's another reason that many pro-Israel groups have moved rightward: to keep contributions flowing in. Portraying Israel as beleaguered and vulnerable and issuing dire warnings about continued or growing anti-Semitism helps maintain a high level of concern among potential supporters, and thus helps ensure these organizations' continued existence. So in 1992, Jonathan Wucher says, we have seen the emergence of a whole new industry in America, of organizations monitoring and purporting to fight anti-Semitism everywhere in the world. The success of the Simon Wiesenthal Center has been particularly striking. It has become a major direct mail fundraising enterprise by outflanking even the ADL in the hunt for anti-Semitic threats to Jewish security. It is sadly not uncommon today to see organizations jockeying for position in a context to determine who among them is toughest in fighting anti-Semitism that is waged in the Jewish press and barrages of direct mail appeals. So they really play into the victim narrative. They're out to get us, fear-mongering, stuff like that, right? And maybe not a shock. We've had a number of prominent incidents that turned out to be they sounded like they were anti-Semitic incidents, and then it turned out they were basically false flags. They were done by someone who was trying to make it look like there's anti-Semitic people, including Jewish people, getting caught painting swastikas on things, right? But anyway, you see the pressure, the fundraising pressure to build up the threat, right? And they sum it up. It is as if these organizations can only thrive if they have an enemy, someone to fight. Hey, there's politics for you, right? So the major organizations in the lobby will continue to advocate policy positions at odds with many of the people in whose name they claim to speak. So if you ask for the views of American Jews, and they're from here to here, where hawkish is here and maybe more peace-oriented is here, the lobby's like way over towards the hawkish, right? It doesn't represent the median view of American Jews. So the role of the neoconservatives. This is what I grew up learning about from Justin Raimondo and Murray Rothbard, the Hoars and Paul Gottfried. They all taught me to hate and fear the neoconservatives, to oppose their drive for the war in Iraq in 2003, which I did, and so forth, right? So anyway, the lobby's drift to the right has been reinforced by the emergence of the neoconservatives. The neoconservative movement has been an important part of American intellectual and political life since the 1970s, but it's drawn particular attention since September 11th. And if you were reading Justin Raimondo and antiwar.com back in those days, you know exactly why it was drawing particular attention. It's because the neocons were behind the WMD lies. They orchestrated the whole thing. They were in positions of influence, and they used those positions of influence to get the war they wanted. Most neoconservatives extol the virtues of American hegemony, and sometimes even the idea of an American empire. And they believe U.S. power should be used to encourage the spread of democracy and discourage potential rivals from even trying to compete with the United States. In their view, spreading democracy and preserving U.S. dominance is the best route to long-term peace. Neoconservatives believe that military force is an extremely useful tool for shaping the world in ways that will benefit Americans. Neoconservatives are hawkish in general. Obviously, they've got a special thing about Israel, but they'll be hawkish about like China and stuff, It's not just Israel. They're just hawks, Well, here's what the authors say. Neoconservatism, in short, is an especially hawkish political ideology. Okay, now I'm going to get into some of the naming names here and stuff because neocons are of particular interest to me. So prominent neoconservatives include former and present policymakers. Now, this book's almost 20 years old, so it's a little out of date, but some of these names I think you'll recognize. Elliott Abrams, Kenneth Edelman, William Bennett, John Bolton, not all Jewish, by the way. John Bolton's not Jewish. Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, he's sometimes been called, Richard Pearl. Paul Wolfowitz, James Woolsey, David Wormser. So those are policymakers. Then on the journalist side, you have Robert Bartley, David Brooks, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, Brett Stevens, Norman Podhoretz. Academics like Fouad Ajami, Elliot Cohen, Aaron Friedberg, Bernard Lewis, Ruth Wedgwood. Think tank pundits like Max Boot. Boo, I hate Boot. Anyway, like Max Boot, David Fromm, Royal, Mark Garrecht, Robert Kagan, Michael Ledeen, Joshua Moravchik. I've interacted with him. And I met William Crystal as well. Daniel Pipes, Danielle Pletka, Michael Rubin, Meirav Wormser. The leading neoconservative magazines and newspapers are Commentary, the New York Sun, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, and the Weekly Standard. Think tanks and advocacy groups most closely associated with neocons are the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, is a really big, important one. The Center for Security Policy, the Hudson Institute, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, JINSA, mentioned before, the Middle East Forum, mentioned before. The Project for a New American Century, PNAC, got very infamous around because of the Iraq War, and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Yeah, that's what WINEP stands for. Virtually all neocons are strongly committed to Israel, a point they emphasize openly and unapologetically. Oh, he doesn't mention him, but sorry, who's the Murray? Douglas Murray, right? He's a British journalist. Yes, thank you. We thought it at the same time, Harold. Douglas Murray.
You'll need to unlock your iPhone first.
Oh, wow. Sorry. Douglas Murray is a British journalist, and he is, well, he wrote a book called Neoconservatism, and he was associate director, whatever, of the Henry Jackson Society. Well, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson was a major sponsor of the neoconservatives. Very important, a name of blessed memory among neoconservatives. So when I saw that Douglas Murray was associate director of the Henry Jackson Society, I was like, oh, wow, okay, this guy is a serious neocon. And no surprise, since October 7th, 2023, was it? Douglas Murray has been all over the place in Israel, posing and advocating and being Israel's #1 cheerleader, right? As we've seen even in the last week or two, with his debate with, or the recent debate with Dave Smith on Joe Rogan, I think it was. I didn't watch it, but people have been discussing that. Okay, let's see. Right, so open and unapologetic. According to Max Boot, a leading neoconservative pundit, supporting Israel is a key tenet of neoconservatism, a position he attributes to, well, you guess the real reason. Anyway, shared liberal democratic values is what Max Boot says. Yeah, that's it. Benjamin Ginsberg, a political scientist who has written extensively about American politics as well as anti-Semitism, convincingly argues that one of the main reasons the neocons moved to the right was their attachment to Israel and their growing frustration during the 60s with a Democratic Party that was becoming increasingly opposed to American military preparedness and increasingly enamored of third world causes. So the neocons were in the Democratic Party, then they were in the Republican Party, then a bunch of them went back to the Democratic Party. People like William Crystal, because they were upset with Trump. Trump won. I assume Trump, too, is winning them over with his Zionism. The neocons embraced Ronald Reagan's hardline anti-communism because they saw it as a political movement that would guarantee Israel's security. And there's a whole saga we're not going to get into about why people like the neocons turned against the Soviet Union, and it has to do with Trotsky and Stalin and stuff like that. Anyway, point is they're leftist. If you ever thought neocons were really conservative on the right, you're wrong. The neocons tend to align with right-wing elements in Israel itself. For example, this is very important, pay attention. It was a group of 8 neoconservatives led by Richard Pearl and including Douglas Feith and David Wormser that drafted the 1996 Clean Break study for incoming Likud Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That study advocated that Israel abandon the Oslo peace process and use bold measures, including military force, to topple unfriendly Middle Eastern regimes and thereby transcend the Arab-Israeli conflict. And of those regimes that they wanted toppled, most of them are gone now since that 1990. So I'm sorry, that's 30 years ago. That was 30 years ago, and one by one, they've been checking the list off. Guess who was on the list that hasn't been toppled yet? Iran. Been hearing anything about them lately? Now you know why. Okay. There are a number of prominent Gentiles who have adopted most, if not all, of the basic tenets of neoconservatism, including vigorous support for Israel and a tendency to favor its more hardline elements. Their ranks include Wall Street Journal editor Robert Bartley, former Secretary of Education William Bennett, former UN ambassadors John Bolton and Jeane Kirkpatrick, and former CIA Director James Woolsey. Having said that, the neocons are not 100% Jewish. They do comprise the core. The Jews comprise the core of the neoconservative movement. Neoconservatives are emblematic insofar as much of their political agenda is at odds with the traditional political views of most American Jews. Okay, so now the Christian Zionists, which I think, are they going to cover them more deeply later? But this is my childhood. I'd like to say I grew up in ground zero of Christian Zionism. So this is all very, well, not all of it, because I wasn't politically connected to these people, but in terms of sort of the mindset, I really grew up with that. So the Christian Zionists, this is a Gentile group that is a key part of this coalition, though not exactly part of the Israel lobby, as we'll see, or not. They function in a different way, shall we say, than most of who we've been talking about. Prominent members of this constituency include religious figures such as the late Jerry Falwell, Gary Bauer, Pat Robertson, John Hagee, as well as politicians like former House Majority Leaders Tom DeLay and Richard Armey, and Senator James Inhofe. I don't know how to say his name, sorry. The Christian Zionists can be thought of as an important junior partner to the various pro-Israel groups in the American Jewish community. The origins of Christian Zionism lie in the theology of dispensationalism, an approach to biblical interpretation that emerged in 19th century England, largely through the efforts of Anglican ministers Lewis Way and John Nelson Darby. So they're sometimes called Darbyites because of Darby. With dispensationalism, the return of the Jews to Palestine is a key event in the preordained process that will lead to the Second Coming. The theology of Darby, Way, and their followers influenced a number of prominent English politicians and may have made British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour more receptive to the idea of creating a Jewish national home in Palestine. Dispensationalist theology was popularized in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries by a number of Protestant theologians, including the evangelist Dwight Moody, C.I. Scofield, and William E. Blackstone. Scofield's name in particular because the Scofield Bible is brought up a lot in this context. He also mentions Hal Lindsey's best-selling Late Great Planet Earth, Timothy LaHaye's Left Behind series. Combined sales, the Left Behind series combined sales reportedly total more than 50 million copies. That feels a little dated. I don't really hear anybody talking about the book series or Late Great Planet Earth much anymore. But when I was a kid, I remember Late Great Planet Earth being around. The founding of the State of Israel in 1948 gave new life to the dispensationalist movement, but the Six-Day War in 1967, which its leaders saw as a miracle of God, was even more important for its emergence as a political force. So again, 1967 is a pivot point for the Jewish aspects of the Israel lobby. It's also a pivot point for the Christian Zionists. Dispensationalists interpreted Israel's seizure of all of Jerusalem and the West Bank, which, like Israel's Likud party, they refer to as Judea and Samaria, as the fulfillment of Old and New Testament prophecy. And these signs encouraged them and other Christian evangelicals to begin working to ensure that the U.S. was on the right side as the Bible's blueprint for the end times unfolded. Okay, got the mute that time. Excuse me. let's see. So, given these beliefs, it's not surprising that Daniel Pipes believes that other than the Israel Defense Forces, America's Christian Zionists may be the Jewish state's ultimate strategic asset. There are organizations, Christian Zionist organizations, Christians United for Israel, CUFI, CUFI, described by founder John Hagee as a Christian version of AIPAC. There's the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel, the Unity Coalition for Israel, Christian Friends of Israel, Israeli Communities, Christians Israel Public Action Committee, International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, a bunch of smaller groups. And then Christian Zionists are key players in the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, a Chicago-based organization run by Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, whose mission is to promote understanding and cooperation between Jews and Christians and to build broad support for Israel. In 2002, they allied with the former Christian Coalition director and GOP strategist Ralph Reed to form a new group, Stand for Israel, that seeks to engage people both spiritually and politically on behalf of Israel, and sponsors an annual International Day of Prayer and Solidarity on Israel's behalf. According to CUFI founder Hagee, we support Israel because all other nations were created by an act of men, but Israel was created by an act of God. Hagee has also told followers that God opposes giving away the land and claims his movement has raised more than $12 million to help settle new immigrants in Israel, including in settlements in the occupied territories. Not getting into the theology and everything, but hopefully you understand that for the Christian Zionists, they see a strong continuity between, ancient Israel that we read about in the Old Testament and the modern nation state of Israel. The most other Christians would see a big discontinuity. They would say that whatever God was doing with Israel, he continued with the church, and the nation state of Israel is just, a secular state in the Middle East. So they wouldn't see this big continuity between Old Israel and New Israel. The Christian Zionists would. All right. Ed McAteer, founder of the Evangelical Religious Roundtable, a major organizing force in the Christian right, once declared that every grain of sand between the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the Mediterranean Sea belongs to the Jews. This includes the West Bank and Gaza. Malcolm Hedding said, "We stand for the right that all the land that God gave under the Abrahamic covenant 4,000 years ago is Israel. There is no such thing as a Palestinian." So they have a very, in terms of, how do you think about the claims of the Palestinians who were already there versus the Jews who just were arriving over the last 100 years or so, and especially, after World War II? How do you balance those claims? Well, for the Christian Zionists like Hagee and so forth, there is no balance. Palestinians go away or something. It all belongs to the Jews because of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay. Ted Beckett describes the mission of his organization as providing solidarity, comfort, and aid to settlers in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. The organization pairs U.S. churches with individual Israeli settlements so that the former can support the latter. These settlers are basically ones who are actively taking land away from Palestinians, okay? Or continuing the taking away of land that began on 1948. So Christian Zionists oppose, obviously, a two-state solution or any other form of territorial concession to the Palestinians. And this, by the way, in the spectrum of positions you can take about Israel-Palestine, this is considered a pretty extreme view. There's, for the Palestinians, you get nothing, Palestinians, zero, right? In 1996, the Third International Christian Zionist Congress resolved that, quote, "the land which he promised to his people is not to be partitioned. It would be further error for the nations to recognize a Palestinian state in any part of Eretz Israel." Pat Robertson suggested that the stroke suffered by Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in January 2006 was divine retribution for Sharon's decision to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. So this is more hardline than the Israeli government itself type of thing, right? And later, Robertson sort of apologized for his inappropriate remarks. But you get the idea. These are hardcore. They take a real hardcore position. In 2002, Tom DeLay told AIPAC's annual policy conference that he opposed giving land to the Palestinians, saying, "I've toured Judea and Samaria. I've stood on the Golan Heights. I didn't see occupied territory. I saw Israel." Richard Armey said he was content to have Israel grab the entire West Bank and that he happened to believe that the Palestinians should leave. Senator James Inhofe told his colleagues in a floor speech explaining why Israel had the right to all of Palestine. "This is the most important reason, because God said so. It is at this place, Hebron, where God appeared to Abraham and said, 'I am giving you this land,' the West Bank." So, when we look at what's happening in Gaza, I don't know, maybe some Christian Zionists would feel a little bit squeamish about what's being done to the people in Gaza. But by and large, I don't think they're going to be jumping in and putting pressure on Israel to cool it for the reasons that we're finding out here. So, despite having some disagreements, like their views of Jesus Christ, the Christian Zionists support an expansionist Israel, and Israeli hardliners support an expansionist Israel. And so they are in alliance, right? A symbiotic relationship thus came into existence after 1977 that served both the ideologies of the Israeli right and the Christian right, or the Christian Zionists better. How do we know that? Well, here's a subtle sign. Menachem Begin's Likud government gave Falwell a private jet in 1979 and made him in 1980 the only Gentile ever to receive the coveted Jabotinsky Medal for Outstanding Achievement. Other recipients include authors Leon Uris and Elie Wiesel. The Israeli government has encouraged Christian tour groups to visit Israel, both as a source of tourism income and to solidify evangelical support back in the U.S. So Christians go to see the Holy Land, to see where Jesus walked, and they get a little political propaganda while they're there, right? Maybe more than a little. Sharon's successor, Ehud Olmert, told a gathering of Christian Zionists who had come to Israel to visit, he said, "You are part of our army, of our power, of our defense." Hal Lindsey, author of The Late Great Planet Earth, wrote in January 2007 that a preemptive nuclear strike on Iran was the only logical choice available to Israel. This is 2007, so this is almost 20 years ago he's saying this. Hagee warned in his 2006 book, Jerusalem Countdown, "The coming nuclear showdown with Iran is a certainty. The war of Ezekiel 38 to 39 could begin before this book gets published." So not only hardline about the Palestinians, but hardline about anyone they perceive as Israel's enemy in the Middle East, like Iran, right? So obviously there's some disagreements, as I said, not only about the status of Jesus, but also, the Christian Zionists tend to be very conservative in U.S. politics, family values, all that stuff. Most Jews aren't. But here's what Nathan Perlmutter, former director of ADL, says. Jews can live with all the domestic priorities of the Christian right, on which liberal Jews differ so radically, because none of these concerns is as important as Israel. So you'll see, Jewish left-wingers screaming about abortion or whatever, but for a lot of them, maybe not the real far left, right, that oppose Zionism, but for a lot of them, liberal Jews in the U.S. Fighting over abortion in America, as passionate as they might get about it, it comes second place to support for Israel. Naomi Cohen says, but for the needs of Israel, most American Jews would have rejected out of hand any dealings with the new Christian right. So this is not a very natural alliance. There's a lot of disagreement. It's just because of Israel that there's any alliance at all. And then, who is this? Gershom Gorenberg notes that dispensationalist theology does not foresee a happy fate for Jews. In the end times, the Jews die or convert. In particular, he warns, the Christian Zionists don't love real Jewish people. They love us as characters in their story, in their play. And it's a 5-act play in which the Jews disappear in the 4th act. So he's like, not sure what he thinks about this thing, you know. So how important is the Christian Zionist branch of the Israel lobby? Well, Christian tourism has become a lucrative source of income for Israel, generates revenue at about $1 billion each year. That was 20 years ago. The presence of a vocal but non-Jewish voice in support of Israel makes U.S. backing more than just a response to special pleading by American Jewry, and probably exerts some effect on the political calculations of politicians who do not have large Jewish constituencies. So that is, you could have someone who, I don't know where all the Jews are, but let's say that you've got you're a Southern congressman, you don't have hardly any Jews there, but you have plenty of Christian Zionists, so you're going to back Israel, right? Yet, here's some nuance. The influence of the Christian Zionists should not be overstated. There are several reasons why Christian Zionists exert less impact on Middle East policy than other parts of the Israel lobby do. They don't really do much direct lobbying of Congress. Israel is only one of many items on the evangelicals' list of concerns. They're not, the Israel lobby is Israel all day, every day, right? The evangelicals have, family values and anti-trans stuff or whatever. Also, Christian Zionists lack the financial power of the major pro-Israel Jewish groups, and they don't have the same media presence when it comes to Middle East issues. So for all these reasons, the Christian Zionists are an adjunct to the Jewish elements of the lobby, but not its most important part. Okay, so so the lobby's source of power. Why is the Israel lobby so effective? One reason is the wide open nature of the American political system. And they talk about, how you can lobby elected representatives and, the U.S. democratic system. So for a group that's highly motivated and has sufficient resources, there's no shortage of ways to influence public policy. In a democracy, even relatively small groups can exercise considerable influence if they are strongly committed to a particular issue and the rest of the population is largely indifferent. Even if the group's absolute numbers are small, policymakers, and especially members of Congress, will tend to accommodate them because they can be confident that the rest of the population will not penalize them for doing so. This is a common thing, by the way, not even specifically about the Israel lobby. I remember learning this long ago. You've got your thing that you're hot on, and you're going to really, reward/punish about your thing. And most of the population just doesn't care that much about whatever your thing is. Well, you're going to have an outsized influence because you care and other people kind of don't, or don't care much, right? So that's you see this in politics quite a bit. So as one U.S. senator put it, there's no political, he was asked why he and his colleagues signed a piece of controversial legislation pushed by the Israel lobby. He said, there's no political advantage in not signing. If you do sign, you don't offend anyone. If you don't, you might offend some Jews in your state, right? So there's upside, and no one's going to go after you for it, but if you don't do it, they will go after you for it. Okay, so whether the issue is farm subsidies or foreign policy, special interest groups often wield political power that far exceeds their absolute numbers in the population. American Jews are prosperous, well-educated, have an admirable philanthropic tradition. They give generously to political parties, and they have very high rates of political participation. A sizable minority of American Jews are not strongly committed to Israel, but a clear majority is at least somewhat engaged, and a significant minority is strongly energized by this issue. When married to the support Israel gets from Christian Zionists, it's a potent political base of support. Equally important is the impressive level of resources and expertise within the major Jewish organizations in the lobby. This whole section, maybe the next couple chapters too, makes me think of what academic agents said about, the organized few, the organized minority, right? As we'll see, this is a very organized set of institutions here. Most major Jewish groups are characterized by large memberships, well-trained professional staffs, adequately finance social welfare and political programs, specialized working groups for particular problems, and elaborate internal communications networks. This is very well organized. These efforts are facilitated by Israel's generally favorable image in the United States. As former Senator Warren Rudman once commented, they have a pretty good product to sell. And finally, the lobby benefits from the absence of effective opposition. You can imagine a pro-Arab organization that would push back on some of these things, right? Well, there are such things, but they're just no match for the major groups that make up the Israel lobby. As Harry Truman famously remarked, in all of my political experience, I don't ever recall the Arab vote swinging a close election, whereas the Jewish vote does sometimes. Also, many Americans sense a degree of cultural proximity between Israel and the United States and believe Israelis are like us. Arabs are often seen as part of an alien or even hostile civilization. And I think there's been plenty of contributions from like Hollywood, say, to underscore that, right? To have Jewish people feel very familiar and Arabs feel very alien. Now, what about the oil issue? Neither Arab governments nor the vaunted oil lobby pose a significant counterweight to the Israel lobby. Remember the frequent claim that the war in Iraq in 2003 was a war for oil, right? And they say, you know, in this view of the world, I think, let's see, yeah, like Noam Chomsky would push this. In this view of the world, portrays the Israel lobby as just one player among many, probably not the most important one in regards to Middle East policy. And there is no question that the U.S. has a major strategic interest in the energy resources located in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. currently imports more of its energy from Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela than from states in the Middle East. That's true, but as we learned with the Russia sanctions, oil and natural gas are bought and sold in a tightly integrated world market, and thus anything that reduces the overall supply is going to push prices up and hurt the American economy. So, you know, this stuff is fungible, right? And as we saw with the Russia sanctions, they stopped selling energy between Europe and Russia just gets it from China, right? You're not really able to do a sanction in that way. The importance of Middle East oil led the United States to become a close ally of Saudi Arabia after World War II, and is one reason why Washington backed the Shah of Iran for many years. The U.S. intervened to evict Iraq from Kuwait after it seized the Sheikhdom in 1990. I think that's usually called the First Gulf War, a policy consistent with the longstanding U.S. policy of preventing any single power from establishing hegemony in the region. So, beyond this obvious interest in providing access to Middle East oil, however, there's little evidence that either wealthy Arab states or a powerful oil lobby has had much impact on the broad thrust of U.S. Middle East policy. If Arab petrodollars or energy companies were driving American policy, one would expect to see the U.S. distancing itself from Israel and working overtime to get the Palestinians a state of their own. You know, we'd get along better with the oil-producing nations if that was the case, right? But even wielding the oil weapon during the 1973 October War, as the Arabs did, had little effect on U.S. support for Israel or on overall American policy in the region. The big oil producers like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, Islamic Republic of Iran, the United States imposed sanctions on all three of these countries in sharp opposition to what the oil industry wanted. In some cases, the U.S. government deliberately intervened to thwart business deals that would have benefited U.S. companies. So the problem with the war for oil thing is Israel calls the shots, not the energy companies, the oil companies or whatever. When it comes to conflict, the exception is, it's the exception that tells you, right? When there's a conflict between these two interests, Israel lobby wins. Oil lobby loses, or energy lobby loses, right? Also, there's a lack of an indigenous base of support in the U.S. Of the Arabs. I'm going to skip a little bit. Yeah, and they talk about Energy companies. Energy companies don't like wars in oil-rich regions, sanctions, or regime change, which the U.S. has been doing plenty of in the Middle East. Each of these policies threatens access to oil and gas reserves, and thus the ability of energy companies to make money. But it doesn't matter. The U.S. does it anyway, right? Okay, now let's see the question of dual loyalty. I'm going to go through this quickly, but according to Mearsheimer and Walt, there's a discredited idea that Jews are loyal only to each other, and that is they don't have loyalty to the country they're in, right? They're just loyal to each other. You can distinguish total loyalty, dual loyalty, divided loyalty. And they argue that Jewish Americans are not disloyal citizens, but they bring it up for a reason. Some Americans are allowed to hold dual citizenship and to serve in foreign armies, like the IDF, and some have done so. Leading American Jews really feel very deeply that American interests and Israeli interests are one and the same. So these arguments that Mearsheimer and Walt attacked are believed by some people, sincerely, I suppose. Mearsheimer and Walt don't agree as realists in international relations. They say no two countries will always have the same interests. For example, it made good strategic sense for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons in the 1960s, but it was not in America's interests to have Israel go nuclear. Nor is it in the U.S. national interest when Israel kills or wounds innocent Palestinian civilians, and especially not when it uses American-made weapons to do it. It gets people mad at us. It causes things like 9/11, right? That's not good for Americans. And then I just wanted to share this. I thought this was quite interesting from Henry Kissinger. He, in terms of the tension between the loyalties, he says, though not practicing my religion, I could never forget that 13 members of my family had died in Nazi concentration camps. Most Israeli leaders were personal friends, and yet I had to subordinate my emotional preferences to my perception of the national interest. It was not always easy. Occasionally, it proved painful. I thought that was quite an interesting quote from Kissinger. Let's see. And then who's this Steinleit? Stephen Steinleit, former director of national affairs at the American Jewish Committee. He says, America has largely tolerated this dual loyalty. We get a free pass, I suspect, largely over Christian guilt about the Holocaust. But it is a reality, he says. So, the Israel lobby is the antithesis of a cabal or conspiracy. It operates out in the open and proudly advertises its own clout. In its basic operations, the Israel lobby is no different from interest groups like the farm lobby, steel and textile workers, and a host of ethnic lobbies, although the groups and individuals who comprise the Israel lobby are in an unusually favorable position to influence U.S. foreign policy. Okay, I'm really going to do 2 more chapters? I guess so. Okay, I'm going to take a drink. We're going to cover a little bit more. I don't cover as much in these chapters. That was a meaty one. That was the main thing I wanted to do. That chapter. But let's look at how they do. So that's what it is, what the lobby is, when it came about, right? Some of the components of the lobby, right? The Christian Zionist aspect, all the different organizations and individuals and journalists and so forth. Now let's look at how it gets things done. So they pursue 2 broad strategies to encourage steadfast U.S. support for Israel. First, they exert significant influence on the policymaking process in Washington. Second, they go to considerable lengths to ensure that public discourse about Israel is favorable. So directly lobbying, and then just a general sort of propaganda effort, I guess you could say, on everyone in America, on Americans in general. So we'll start with Capitol Hill. Unlike virtually every other country, Israel is largely immune from criticism on Capitol Hill. let's see, what happened? Oh, yeah. So there was a hearing on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process held in 2007. The subcommittee sought testimony from 3 witnesses. Despite some differences on certain policy issues, all 3 are central players in the lobby, all the ones who came to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Martin Indyk, former AIPAC official, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, who now heads the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, David Makovsky of the pro-Israel Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and the neoconservative pundit Daniel Pipes, who directs the right-wing Middle East Forum. And so somebody commented, this was a hearing about 2 sides of a conflict where only one side was allowed to speak. You can see why they lead off with that story, right? Majority Leader Richard Army said in September 2002, my number 1 priority in foreign policy is to protect Israel. You might think that the top priority for any U.S. representative would be to protect America, but that's not what Army said. So they cite that just to show how effective the lobbying is. And not just with the senators and congressmen, but it notes there are a lot of guys at the working level up here on Capitol Hill who happen to be Jewish, who are willing to look at certain issues in terms of their Jewishness. These are all guys who are in a position to make the decision in these areas for those senators. You can get an awful lot done just at the staff level. So there's the influencing the elected representatives, and then you have the staff. And a lot of the staff are Zionists, are part of the Israel lobby. So AIPAC's success is due in large part to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda and to punish those who do not, based mainly on its capacity to influence campaign contributions. Despite its name, PAC is at the end of AIPAC, right? Political Action Committee. It is not a political action committee. It does not officially endorse candidates or give money directly to their campaigns. I think this helped them. Are they going to explain this? There's a reason they're structured this way. Anyway, instead, they screen potential candidates and arrange meetings with potential donors and fundraisers. So they just network and bring people together, right? And they provide information to the growing number of pro-Israel PACs. So here's testimony from Tom Hayden, anti-war figure, who was running in the early 80s. He explains how he won support from the local power broker, Michael Berman, on the condition that he would always be a good friend to Israel. Hayden, who won the election, notes that he had to be certified kosher, not once, but over and over again. The certifiers were the elites, beginning with rabbis and heads of the multiple mainstream Jewish organizations. An important vetting role was held as well by AIPAC, a group closely associated with official parties in Israel. When necessary, Israeli ambassadors, consuls general, and other officials would intervene with statements declaring someone a friend of Israel. In the same vein, this is just giving you an idea how this works. Harry Lonsdale, the Democratic candidate who ran unsuccessfully against Senator Mark Hatfield in 1990, described his own visit to AIPAC headquarters during that campaign. The word that I was pro-Israel got around, he writes. I found myself invited to AIPAC in Washington, D.C., fairly early in the campaign for discussions. It was an experience I will never forget. It wasn't enough that I was pro-Israel. I was given a list of vital topics and quizzed, grilled, for my specific opinion on each. Actually, I was told what my opinion must be and exactly what words I was to use to express those opinions in public. Shortly after that encounter at AIPAC, I was sent a list of American supporters of Israel that I was free to call for campaign contributions. I called. They gave, from Florida to Alaska. All right, so if they vet you hard, and if they vet you, if you get through the vetting, the pocketbook's open, the wallet's open, right? When a prominent member of Congress was once asked the reason for the power of AIPAC in the legislature, he replied, money. It's as simple as that. Between 1990 and 2004, reports The Economist, Pro-Israel groups contributed nearly $57 million to candidates and parties, while Arab American and Muslim PACs contributed slightly less than $800,000. So 57 million versus less than a million. If you are a candidate and you get the pro-Israel label from AIPAC, the money starts coming in from contributors all over the country. Okay, now, so that's the carrot. Now let's talk about the stick. Perhaps the most renowned example of the costs that can befall a politician who crosses AIPAC is the defeat of Senator Charles Percy, Republican from Illinois, in 1984. Despite a generally pro-Israel voting record, Percy incurred AIPAC's wrath by declining to sign the AIPAC-sponsored Letter of 76, protesting President Ford's threatened reassessment of U.S. Middle East policy in 1975. He also made the mistake of calling PLO leader Yasser Arafat more moderate than some other Palestinian terrorists. Percy's opponents in both the primary and general election in 1984 received large sums from pro-Israel PACs, and a businessman from another state, from California, Michael Goland, who was also a major contributor to AIPAC, spent $1.1 million on anti-Percy advertising in Illinois. Goland was, by the way, later convicted of making illegal campaign contributions in a different race. As Tom Dine boasted after Percy's narrow defeat, all the Jews in America from coast to coast gathered to oust Percy. And the American politicians, those who hold public positions now and those who aspire, got the message. And so J.J. Goldberg, editor of The Forward, said in 2002, "There is this image in Congress that you don't cross these people or they take you down." It talks about Jesse Helms, famous sort of considered very extreme right-wing guy. He, in 84, he had a tough re-election. AIPAC channeled large amounts of campaign money to his opponent, who almost won. Well, even though they didn't defeat Helms, he got the message. He traveled to Israel the following year. Have you ever heard of a U.S. politician doing this, by the way? And he had his picture taken with a yarmulke on his head, kissing the Western Wall. That's not practice. Does anyone else do that? The same trip also produced a picture of the senator with Ariel Sharon for his office wall. More important, Helms became a vocal supporter of Israel and remained one until his retirement in 2002. So he felt the sting of the whip and he turned himself right around. Senator Hillary Clinton, listen to this, an evolution there. She supported Palestinian statehood in 1998. She embraced Suha Arafat, wife of Yasser Arafat, in 1999. The lobby was not happy. But then once she began running for office herself, she became an ardent defender of Israel, and now she gets strong backing, including financial support from pro-Israel organizations and individuals. So I guess there's forgiveness, right? Let's see. Jimmy Carter in February 2007 said, "I don't see any present prospect that any member of the U.S. Congress, the House, or Senate would say, let's take a balanced position between Israel and the Palestinians and negotiate a peace agreement." He added, "It's almost politically suicidal for a member of the Congress who wants to seek re-election to take any stand that might be interpreted as anti-policy of the conservative Israeli government." AIPAC is often called upon to draft speeches, work on legislation, advise on tactics, perform research, collect co-sponsors, marshal votes. That is, AIPAC inserts itself directly into the legislative and policy-making process with a lot of frequency. And the second half of the book is going to get into that. There's an AIPAC sister organization, the American Israel Education Foundation. It funds free congressional trips to Israel itself. They're called junkets for some reason. About 10% of all congressional trips overseas are to Israel. So a lot of places in the world, 10% of the time they go to one little place in the Middle East. Even though it is what, let's see. So bottom line is AIPAC bills itself as America's pro-Israel lobby, has an almost unchallenged hold on Congress, one of the three main branches of the American government, firmly committed to supporting Israel. I forget, was it Sobran? Anyway, somebody said Congress is Israeli-occupied territory. Open debate about U.S. policy toward Israel does not occur there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. Senator Ernest Hollings said, you can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. Another senator wouldn't even put his name to this. This is spoke on condition of anonymity. My colleagues think AIPAC is a very, very powerful organization that is ruthless and very, very alert. 80% of the senators here roll their eyes on some of the votes. They know that what they're doing isn't what they really believe is right. But why fight on a situation where they're liable to get beat up on? Okay, so that's Congress. Then quickly on the president's executive situation. So groups in the lobby exert significant leverage over the executive branch. American presidents are not as sensitive to pressure as Congress is, and most of them have taken positions that Israel or the lobby opposed at one time or another. But such instances are becoming increasingly rare. Despite their small numbers in the population, less than 3%, American Jews make large campaign donations to candidates for both parties. The Washington Post once estimated that Democratic presidential candidates depend on Jewish supporters to supply as much as 60% of the money raised from private sources. So 360, less than 3%, 60% of Democratic donations. There's a new ratio for you, 360. American Jews wield power through their high concentration in key states and their tendency to behave as a swing vote in ways that set them apart from virtually all other groups in American politics. Because Jewish votes matter in close elections, presidential candidates go to considerable lengths to cultivate their support. Talks about how John Edwards, Mitt Romney, and John McCain, when they were presidential candidates, made emphatic pro-Israel speeches. They wanted to avoid the fate that befell Howard Dean in the 2004 presidential campaign when he made the mistake of recommending that the U.S. take a more even-handed role in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In response, one of Dean's rivals for the nomination, Joseph Lieberman, accused him of selling Israel down the river and labeled his statement irresponsible. Virtually all of the top Democrats in the House of Representatives signed a hard-hitting letter to Dean criticizing his comments. And the Chicago Jewish Star reported that anonymous attackers are clogging the email inboxes of Jewish leaders around the country, warning, without much evidence, that Dean would somehow be bad for Israel. So that's, they write letters, they call, all that, but there's a more obvious way to shape an administration's policy. They have individuals in the administration, right? Who is this? Katz? New York businessman Chaim Katz was told, we have a dozen people in Clinton's campaign in the headquarters. They're all going to get big jobs. The Clinton administration's Middle East policy was heavily shaped by officials with close ties to Israel or to prominent pro-Israel organizations. Martin Indyk, previously mentioned, he was Clinton's National Security Council. He was ambassador to Israel, assistant secretary of state. Dennis Ross served as Clinton's special envoy to the Middle East and then joined WINEP after leaving government. They were among President Clinton's closest advisors at the Camp David summit in July 2000. The American delegation at Camp David took most of its cues from Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, coordinated negotiating positions with Israel in advance, and did not offer its own independent proposals for settling the conflict. Palestinian representatives at the Camp David negotiations protested that they were negotiating with two Israeli teams, one displaying an Israeli flag and one an American flag. Let's see here. Why do I not? Oh, I see. It's over here. Just curious if anyone's still with me. Okay, this is a long one. Sorry. Problems even more pronounced in the second Bush administration. Ranks have included staunchly pro-Israel neocons like Elliot Abrams, John Bolton, Douglas Feith, Aaron Friedberg, John Hanna, I. Lewis Libby, William Luty, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, David Wormser. Yeah, the George W. Bush administration. Whew. The second one was just honeycombed with neocons. Okay, I'm going to do one more and then wrap it up. I think I'm going to go through this more quickly. I wanted to kind of get the whole picture of the Israel lobby as in, how it became what it is, how it operates. I wanted to do it all in one show, So I'll take another drink and let's do one more chapter here. This is chapter 6, Dominating Public Discourse. So the previous chapter was about politicians, right? This is about the Americans in general, influencing Americans in general. So groups in the lobby try to marginalize anyone who criticizes Israeli policy or challenges the special relationship. And they try to prevent that person's view from getting a fair hearing in the public arena. To do this, the lobby has a very heavy-handed tactic. Maybe you've heard of it. They accuse someone of being anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic. So if you don't agree with how the U.S. is doing its Middle East foreign policy, you probably just hate all the Jews or something, right? An open, candid discussion of Israeli policy in the occupied territories, Israeli history, the lobby's role in shaping America's Middle East policy could easily lead more Americans to question existing policy toward Israel and to call for a relationship with Israel that more effectively serves the U.S. national interest. So they don't want that. They want to control the message, right? America's media coverage of Israel tends to be strongly biased in Israel's favor, especially when compared with news coverage in other democracies. The debate is especially lively in Israel itself, by the way, the one state where Jews clearly do control the media. So they get to argue more about it in Israel than is allowed in U.S. public discourse. So that's interesting, isn't it? The lobby's perspective on Israel is widely reflected in the mainstream media, in part because a substantial number of American commentators who write about Israel are themselves pro-Israel. At virtually every level of media organization, from local communities, syndicated columnists, major national papers, to the international news services that supply the country with information, that would be like Reuters and AP, I guess. Pro-Israel groups were more successful than pro-Arab groups at getting their side of the story transmitted to both the articulate and mass publics. Eric Alterman in 2002 listed 56 columnists and commentators who can be counted upon to support Israel reflexively and without qualification. Conversely, he identified only 5 pundits who consistently criticize Israeli behavior or endorse pro-Arab positions. There's no American commentator comparable to a Robert Fisk or a Patrick Seal, who are often sharply critical of Israel and who will publish regularly in British newspapers. And no one remotely like Israeli commentators. Amira Haas, Akiva Elder, Gideon Levy, and Bradley Burston, all of whom are openly critical of particular policies that their country pursues. So the American media is really locked down. Commentary's former editor Norman Podhoretz once told a gathering of journalists in Jerusalem that the role of Jews who write in both the Jewish and general press is to defend Israel and not join in the attacks on Israel. Martin Peretz, the longtime editor of the New Republic, once proclaimed, "I am in love with the state of Israel," and admitted that there's a sort of party line on Israel at his journal. Rooting out perceived anti-Israeli Israel bias in the media has become, for many American Jews, the most direct and emotional outlet for connecting with the conflict 6,000 miles away. One CNN executive has said that he sometimes gets 6,000 email messages in a single day complaining that a story is anti-Israel. And papers such as the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Washington Post, have faced consumer boycotts over their Middle East reporting. So the pressure is on if any journalists try to deviate from this, from the Israel lobby's line. One of the lobby's most energetic media watchdog groups, though not the only one, is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, CAMRA. In 2006, CAMRA ran expensive full-page advertisements in the New York Times and New York Sun criticizing Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Ads that included the publisher's phone number and encouraged readers to call and complain. Let's see. Sorry, I need more of the story to share this. This is interesting. Yeah, here we go. New York Times Magazine had an article, How to Talk About Israel by Ian Baruma. He made the obvious point that it is sometimes difficult to talk critically and dispassionately about Israel in the U.S., and pointed out that even legitimate criticism of Israel or of Zionism is quickly denounced as anti-Semitism by various watchdogs. In response, Bret Stephens, editor of the Jerusalem Post and now an editorial board member at the Wall Street Journal, published a vitriolic open letter in the Post that began by asking Baruma, "Are you a Jew?" One must be at least a Jew to tell the Goyim how they may or may not talk about Israel. The message of this remarkable letter was, in short, non-Jews should talk about this subject only in ways that Jews deem acceptable. An editor at the New York Times asked the historian Tony Judt to identify himself as Jewish in an op-ed he wrote defending the original London Review of Books article that became the book we're going through right now. Tell them you're Jewish. You have the J pass, so you can talk about Israel, right? Israeli policy. ADL head Abraham Foxman told New York Times Magazine writer James Traub that it is naive to think that the free market of ideas ultimately sifts falsehood to produce truth. Experience has taught Foxman that the truth does not win on its own merits. The market for falsehood is too powerful. So this whole thing about, free market of ideas, Israel lobby doesn't buy that. They're like, no, we're gonna get out there and we're gonna crush anyone who expresses an idea we disagree with. We're not gonna just let the truth out through debate. Screw that. So then think tanks went up. This caught my attention. Its board of advisors includes prominent pro-Israel figures such as Edward Luttwak, Martin Peretz, Richard Pearl, James Woolsey, and Mortimer Zuckerman. We've heard most of those names, but Edward Luttwak caught my attention because Bronze Age Pervert brings him up and has had him on a show, I think, and features Luttwak. I did a little search on Twitter on his account, and there are lots of mentions of Luttwak. I didn't realize what a Israel lobby guy Luttwak was, so that's interesting. Pro-Israel individuals have established a commanding presence at the American Enterprise Institute, Center for Security Policy, Foreign Policy Research Institute, the Heritage Foundation, it's a really big one, Hudson Institute, Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA. These think tanks are all decidedly pro-Israel and include few, if any, critics of U.S. support for the Jewish state. And then they talk about the evolution of the Brookings Institution, another big important conservative think tank. They produced a study that was seen as a blueprint behind the Carter administration's successful efforts to negotiate an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. But now Brookings' work is conducted through its Saban Center for Middle East Policy, which was established in 2002 with a $13 million grant, primarily financed by Chaim Saban, an ardent Zionist, who told the Times, "I'm a one-issue guy and my issue is Israel." So anyway, the point is Brookings at one time was sort of asking for balance and stuff, and now they're just, somebody paid them a bunch of money and now they're Zionists. And then they talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, very CFR, Academic Agent talks a lot about the CFR or their magazine journal Foreign Policy. And they've come under a lot of pressure. Anyway, I'm not getting into the details about that. Okay, so this is the interesting part and might shed some light on, you might have heard about the protests at Columbia and efforts by Jewish donors to get universities to come down on student protests and so forth, right? And even more recently, the Trump administration has started to kick people out of the country, or it looks like it's going to be kicking some people out of the country, students on a student visa, because they're critical of Israel, right? Well, this is part of a long-running campaign against the one area that the Israel lobby has not had such great control over. They say the lobby's campaign to mold debate about Israel has faced the greatest difficulty in academia. Professors have tenure. Intellectual freedom is a core value. Challenging the prevailing wisdom is common and often prized. There's a deep-seated commitment to freedom of speech on college and university campuses. And there's an internationalization of American universities over the past 30 years. They're talking about now it's been 50 years. That's brought a large number of foreign-born students and professors to the U.S., and they are often more critical of Israel's conduct than Americans tend to be. So for all these reasons, academia has actually been like sort of a holdout in terms of allowing some dissent, right? Criticism at colleges and universities rose sharply after the Oslo process collapsed and Ariel Sharon came to power in February 2001. And then the criticism at universities became especially intense in the spring of 2002 when the IDF reoccupied Palestine-controlled areas in the West Bank and employed massive force against the Second Intifada. As one would expect, the lobby moved aggressively to take back the campuses. Talks about some of the things the lobby does, but listen to this. Christians United for Israel, Kufi, Hagee's group, formed a partnership with the David Project, a Boston-based pro-Israel group focused on campus issues. Their goal is to establish college chapters and training programs designed to help Christian students make the case for Israel. The campaign to cultivate students has been accompanied by efforts to influence university faculty and hiring practices. AIPAC recruited students in the 80s to help it identify professors and campus organizations that might be considered anti-Israel. One group distributed a small booklet containing background information on pro-Arab sympathizers active on college campuses who used their anti-Zionism as merely a guise for their deeply felt anti-Semitism. And then Daniel Pipes established Campus Watch in 2002. I remember that happening. A number of philanthropists have established Israel studies programs at U.S. universities, in addition to the roughly 130 Jewish studies programs that already exist, so as to increase the number of Israel-friendly scholars on campus. Sheldon Adelson's proposed multi-million-dollar gift to expand the existing program for Jewish civilization at Georgetown University to create a center focusing on the Jewish theme as a paradigm of international relations. In the summer of 2002, pro-Israel groups at the University of Chicago claimed that there was an atmosphere of intimidation and hate for Jewish students on campus. We've been hearing this recently, and charged that the faculty and administration were doing nothing about the problem. Notice that this is when Israel was really, killing people. Now they're doing it again. Students are protesting again. And again, we're hearing charges that, look at the anti-Semitism brewing on the campus. It seems to me that it is more of a reaction to what the Israeli government is doing. That's if you track it, track the rise and fall of anti-Semitism, it seems to have a lot more to do with just what Israel's up to at the time, right? It talks about what happened with Juan Cole. I remember that. I was reading Juan Cole back then, and I remember a critic of Israel, and I remember what happened where they destroyed his appointment at Yale. The authors have some experience with the tactics themselves. Not going to go into the details there because of the article in the book, or the article. Sheldon Adelson's proposed multi-million-dollar gift. Wait, what happened here? Did I go the wrong way? Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. There we go. Yeah, okay, so talking about the articles, following the publication of our original article, The Israel Lobby, in March 2006, the president of the War College received phone calls from several members of Congress who questioned whether it was appropriate to have us speak at the conference there. Now, in that case, the pressure didn't work, right? But they got to see the kind of campaign that, it got aimed at them, right? In addition to targeting faculty and hiring on campus, a number of pro-Israel academics and groups have tried to suppress publication of scholarly works that challenge their particular views. In 1998, for example, the ADL called on the publisher of Norman Finkelstein and Ruth Bettina Burns' A Nation on Trial to halt its release. A Nation on Trial is a sharply worded critique of Daniel Goldhagen's controversial bestseller, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Similar episode took place in 2003 when lawyers representing the Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz sent threatening letters to the University of California Press in an attempt to halt publication of Norman Finkelstein's book, Beyond Chutzpah, an extended critique of Dershowitz's own book, The Case for Israel. If you've never seen a Norman Finkelstein clip, I'd recommend pulling one up on YouTube. He's pretty good critic of what Israel does. What Israel's been doing in Gaza and so forth. There's a campaign to keep Americans from reading or hearing critical views about Israel, even at the high school level. And so, summing it all up, pro-Israel groups and individuals have fought a multi-front battle against students, professors, administrators, the curriculum itself, to shape discourse on campus. Their efforts have not been as successful in academia as have been on Capitol Hill or even in the media, but their work has not been in vain. Despite the continued turmoil in the region and Israel's continued expansion in the occupied territories, there's less criticism of Israel on college campuses today, in 2007, than there was 5 years ago. So they did have some effect, but then as we saw since October 7th, 2023, there's been more student protests and more battles back and forth trying to suppress those student protests. And a president, what's her name? Nadine Gay or whatever. They got them to get rid of a president, one of the Ivies. I'm forgetting which one she is president of, because she was not sufficiently supportive of Israel. Now, they mostly talk about the above board activities, but this interests me, and in fact, I want to have a guest or two, at least one guest on, to talk about this in more depth, and that is underground or illegitimate, illegal activities that are done in support of Israel. But even Mearsheimer and Walt have a little section here they call objectionable tactics, delicately put. Some pro-Israel individuals and groups have occasionally taken their defense of Israel to illegitimate extremes, attempting to silence individuals who hold views they dislike. Jute has reported receiving death threats against him and his family because of his criticisms of Israeli policy. Then there was a play called My Name is Rachel Corrie about the young woman who was killed in March 2003 by an Israeli bulldozer when she was attempting to prevent the IDF from demolishing a Palestinian home in the Gaza Strip. I remember that happening. The play, which was based on Corrie's diaries and emails, opened in April 2005 at the Royal Court Theatre in London. It was widely acclaimed. It was going to open in March 2006 in New York, at a place that has a well-established reputation for staging controversial productions, only to be postponed about a month before its scheduled opening. They got pressure, they buckled, but then eventually the original Royal Court production was brought about a year later for a limited run. Overzealous pursuit of supposedly dangerous critics has even landed one prominent group in the lobby in a courtroom. In the 80s and 90s, the ADL enlisted the services of a private investigator named Roy Bullock, who had also done intelligence gathering for the apartheid government in South Africa. Bullock, in turn, obtained information from an LA police intelligence officer who allegedly removed confidential documents from the police department and the Department of Motor Vehicles. In addition to white supremacists and neo-Nazi groups, the targets of this surveillance included a number of Jewish dissidents, Arab American groups, other critics of Israeli government policies. The police officer ultimately pleaded no contest to unauthorized use of a police computer, but the district attorney was reluctant to prosecute the ADL because he thought the ADL was a force for good. Instead, he accepted an offer by the ADL to pay $75,000 to fight bigotry in the local area, and no criminal charges were filed against the organization or Bullock. So that is just a hint of some dirty tactics. I think there's a lot more to be said on this that Mearsheimer and Walt don't get into. Claudine Gay was Harvard, and more than one IB president was removed over this. Okay, since October 7th. So the new anti-Semitism. All right, almost done here, but this is a critical issue. No discussion of how the lobby operates would be complete without examining one of its most powerful weapons, the charge of anti-Semitism. Anyone who criticizes Israeli actions or says that pro-Israel groups have significant influence over U.S. Middle East policy stands a good chance of getting labeled an anti-Semite. In fact, anyone who says that there is an Israel lobby runs the risk of being charged with anti-Semitism, despite them, on the one hand being, got to be known to scare people, right? So that loud and proud and all that since the 70s. And yet you're not supposed to talk about them, but also you're supposed to be scared of them and know that they will get you if you cross them. Anyway, it's one of those parallax things, right? If you say, isn't it great how powerful and effective the Israel lobby is, and they're wonderful, then it's okay. If you talk about the Israel lobby negatively, suddenly you're in trouble, right? So it's okay to recognize it sometimes, depending on how you recognize it. I'm sorry. They say it right here. The lobby both boasts of its own power and frequently attacks those who call attention to it. So, anti-Semitism. They're talking about people saying there's a whole contagion of anti-Semitism. It's as bad as it was in the 1930s, all this stuff. Measuring anti-Semitism is a complicated matter, but the weight of evidence points in the opposite direction of anti-Semitism growing. In the spring of 2004, when accusations of European anti-Semitism were prevalent in America, there were surveys of European public opinion conducted by the ADL, by the way, and the Pew Research Center, and both of them showed that anti-Semitism was declining. And they talk about how a poll of French citizens in 2002 found that 89% could envisage living with a Jew, 97% believed making anti-Semitic graffiti is a serious crime, 87% thought attacks on French synagogues are scandalous, 85% of practicing French Catholics rejected the charge that Jews have too much influence in business and finance. The French police reported that anti-Semitic incidents had declined by about almost 50% in 2005. And that's quite saying something because France has the largest Muslim population of any country in Europe. And yet anti-Semitic incidents are declining. More Jews from the former Soviet Empire immigrated to Germany than to Israel, making it the fastest growing Jewish community in the world. So if we're really as bad as it was in the 30s, it's hard to imagine that Jews would be moving to Germany in large numbers, right? So this doesn't really, rising anti-Semitism doesn't really, the authors can't find any evidence for this, right? So when pressed to go beyond vague assertions, pro-Israel groups now claim that there is a new anti-Semitism, which they equate with criticism of Israel. So this is what it means now, right? Supporters of Israel, in fact, have a history of using fears of a new anti-Semitism to shield Israel from criticism. In 1974, when Israel was under increasing pressure to withdraw from the lands it had conquered in 1967, the ADL published a book called The New Anti-Semitism, which argued that anti-Semitism was on the rise and exemplified by the growing unwillingness of other societies to support Israel's actions. They also suggested many asemitic actions. The Perlmutters suggested many asemitic actions in their book, The Real Anti-Semitism in America. They define asemitic as acts not motivated by hostility to Jews, but may nonetheless harm Jewish interests, and especially Israel's well-being, and could easily bring back genuine anti-Semitism. And here's what the troubling logic of the argument. There was little mention of anti-Semitism during the 90s when Israel was involved in the Oslo peace process. Indeed, one Israeli scholar wrote in 1995 that never before, at least since the time Christianity seized power over the Roman Empire, has anti-Semitism been less significant than at present. But then charges of anti-Semitism became widespread in the spring of 2002 when Israel came under severe criticism around the world for its brutal behavior in the occupied territories. So when Israel is being peaceful, and anti-Semitism declines. When everyone's watching videos of Israel slaughtering people, anti-Semitism arises. So this is what anti-Semitism now means, right? Western critics of Israel hardly ever question the right of Israel to exist. Instead, they question its behavior toward the Palestinians, which is a legitimate criticism. Many Israelis question it themselves. A few critics may single Israel out for undue criticism, but Israel, for the most part, is judged by the same standard that people in the West apply to all democracies. That is, if France was doing that to people, you'd get anti-Frenchism, I guess, right? Israel, in other words, is expected to behave like contemporary Britain, Canada, Denmark, the US. Israel claims to be, we're part of the family of democracies, the only democracy in the Middle East. And then when they're held to the standards of the behavior of other democracies, well, then, that's anti-Semitism. The US was widely condemned for abuses that occurred at the Abu Ghraib prison, for the way it treated detainees at Guantanamo. But America is not being held to a double standard. It's being expected to live up to its own stated values and to widely accepted human rights principles, and so is Israel, right? So they're like, this persecution complex doesn't make any sense. Israel does nasty things, and they get critiqued. When they don't do nasty things, things calm down. This is not hard to understand, right? So the great silencer. The charge of anti-Semitism is one of the most powerful epithets one can level at someone in America, and no respectable person wants to be tarred with that brush. The fear of being called an anti-Semite discourages many individuals from voicing reservations about Israel's conduct or the merits of U.S. support. Smearing critics of Israel or the lobby with the charge of anti-Semitism marginalizes them in the public arena. If the accusation sticks, the critics' arguments will not be taken seriously by the media, government officials, other influential elites, and groups that might otherwise pay attention to that person's views will be discouraged from soliciting them. Politicians will be especially reluctant to associate themselves with anyone who has been charged as anti-Semitic, because it could ruin their own careers. And this tactic works because it's difficult for anyone to prove beyond all doubt that he or she is not anti-Semitic, especially when criticizing Israel or the lobby. Proving a negative is hard, right? Until recently, therefore, the charge of anti-Semitism has been a potent way to make sure that criticism of Israel or the lobby were rarely spoken and were either ignored or disparaged when they were. The accusation is likely to resonate among American Jews, many of whom still believe that anti-Semitism is rife, right? That victim complex we talked about that is stoked by the Israel lobby, keeping the Jewish people afraid. You imagine the elderly Jewish lady reading the letter from the ADL, freaking out. There's a lot of, I'm not picking on the Israel lobby here. There's a lot of stoking of fear that's done by various groups, but they do it too. As Peter Novick makes clear in his seminal book, The Holocaust in American Life, that cataclysmic event has become a key element of American Jewish consciousness. It defines how many American Jews think about the world around them. Not surprisingly, it has fostered a powerful sense of victimization for some of them. Jack Wertheimer notes, by virtually any measure, domestic anti-Semitism has declined sharply. However, many American Jews continue to believe that other Jews in the U.S. are targets of bigotry, right? So they're like, I'm fine. I get along with my neighbors, but I hear that things are happening out there, right? Frank Rich, New York Times columnist, wrote, Like many other Jews, I am perhaps all too willing to believe that the entire world is anti-Semitic. The profound sense of fear among American Jews was clearly evident when Israel was harshly criticized around the world in the spring of 2002 because of the way Israel was behaving, right? Nat Hintoff, for the Village Voice, remarked at the time that if a loudspeaker goes off and a voice says, "All Jews gather in Times Square," it could never surprise me. A little over the top, dude. And the New York Observer's Ron Rosenbaum warned American Jews that a second Holocaust against Israel was likely. Leon Weissleiter, a deeply committed defender of Israel, felt like this was getting a little too nuts, so he wrote a cover story entitled "Hitler is Dead, the Case Against Jewish Ethnic Panic." Describing Jews in the US, he wrote, "The community is sunk in excitability, in the imagination of disaster. There is a loss of intellectual control. Death is at every Jewish door. Fear is wild. Reason is derailed. Anxiety is the supreme proof of authenticity. Imprecise and inflammatory analogies abound. Holocaust imagery is everywhere." So he's like, whoa, guys, calm down. In short, many American Jews find it easy to believe that a person who criticizes either Israel's actions or the influence of groups like AIPAC, probably an anti-Semite, right? Carter's book made a big splash using the term apartheid, right? But a prominent Israeli politician noted there's nothing in the criticism that Carter has for Israel that's not been said by Israelis themselves. Again, sharing their own story. When their original article, "The Israel Lobby," was published in the London Review of Books in March 2006, the authors of this book were widely and falsely accused of being anti-Semites. Elliot Cohen published an op-ed about our piece in the Washington Post titled, "Yes, It's Anti-Semitic." And the New York Sun immediately linked us with David Duke. So they try to turn their critics toxic, right? But they note, now this is almost 20 years ago, and so one wonders if this trend has continued since then. They say there are signs that the reflexive charge of anti-Semitism is beginning to lose its power to stifle debate. Even William Crystal seems to have recognized that calling critics of Israel or the lobby anti-Semites is losing its capacity to silence others. Writing in the Wall Street Journal that the mainstream Jewish organizations have played anti-Semitism card so often it has been devalued. Okay, there we go. So, super strong, well-organized lobbying effort with the, complete domination of the U.S. Congress and Senate. Great influence in the executive branch in the presidential administrations. We can see this very strongly in the second Trump administration, for example. But, nothing unique there. It's been true for quite a while in the presidential administrations, recent presidential administrations. The academia has actually been a bit of a holdout, and some criticism has been allowed, but they've been working on that, right, and made great strides in the last few years in particular. And then in regards to the population in general, they shut down criticism by using the term anti-Semite against people and stuff like that. Okay, I don't know if I have any super chats, and I've been pushing myself with these, so my voice is about gone. I meant to. Okay, I failed. Here, let me see if I can do this real quick before I let you go. I don't know what's going on, as some people saw on Twitter. Black Horse is taking a break from talking about U.S. politics because people have been kind of going crazy on him, which is really unfair because I think he's been very objective, a great analyst on these things. I think the shows we've been doing together have been really good. Any critics, I recommend you go take a look. But he is wanting a pause from doing econ minis. So I don't think I have a show with him as far as I know next week. I might try to talk him into it, but I doubt I'll be successful. So I don't know what I'll do because I usually can't do the kind of prep I do for these shows every week. It's just too much. So I actually am a little up in the air about what I'll do. I might skip the show and do next week and do an appearance on the Pony Express Radio for the Old Glory Club because my show is on Thursday. I almost never participate in that. It's very rare for me to be on it, and we have a conference coming up. So we'll see if they'd be willing to have me. I'm part of the leadership. If we are willing to have me, then I might skip and be on Pony Express Radio next week, bring my perspective there. Thanks to RD8 on Subscribestar, sending in a tip just with a thumbs up. Thank you for your support. And then I didn't see any, where am I? Here we go. I didn't see any super chats. I'll glance over real quick, see if something jumps out. Oh, that's interesting. Not the USA, Harold says, but a case that revealed Israel and Europe was a Lillehammer affair, where Israel was proven to have death squads who assassinated people in Europe. Yeah, see, that's the kind of thing that Mearsheimer and Walt don't touch, that sort of underground or illegal activity. But I know an expert on that sort of stuff, and I've already asked him to come on the series when I finish with the book and want to keep going and in covering this. So we'll see if I can get him, but I'm hoping to have him on when I finish going through the book and bring in sort of that underworld aspect of how the Zionists operate, I guess you could say. Yeah, we did figure out it was Claudine Gay at Harvard, but then there was another president too somewhere that they got rid of. They were put pressure and got rid of. Yeah, Harold says they don't use their own money. They use the taxpayers' money like USAID. Actually, I think as the book documents, there's plenty of money coming from Jewish billionaires, regular Jewish people contributing, being engaged in politics, contributing to local campaigns. There might be some tax money going on towards the lobby, but I think, frankly, mostly it's private money from Jewish donors and some Christian Zionists too, I'm sure. Yeah, and Harold said, how is dual loyalty discredited when they have dual citizenship and betray one side? It always only goes one way. And of course, in a previous episode, we talked about, the spy who gave a lot of nuclear information to the Israel, and he is now in Israel after being in prison for a long time here in the U.S. Anyway, not going to try to cover it all, just glancing through real quick. Okay, well, thanks for joining. I hope you find this interesting. I know it's kind of deep, a lot of detail, a lot going on, but I feel like it's important if you don't like the sort of amount of influence that the Israel lobby has, sort of beyond a regular political lobby in the country, on the U.S., then I think it's important to actually understand a little bit about the reality of it, that it wasn't always there. It really arose around 1967 as an organized network, and that it's mostly above ground, as Mearsheimer and Walter documenting. It's, you can find these organizations. You might have to dig a little, right? But mostly, you can look at their mission statement. We're a political action committee that supports Israel. Not subtle, right? So it's not like that hard to find. You don't have to have like conspiracy theories and stuff like that. You can just look it up. What are the major lobbying Jewish organizations? Even Grok or whatever, even these AI things should tell you this. Anyway, okay. Well, that's what I'll do for today, and we'll see what happens next week. Even if I do nothing next week, I hope to be back in 2 weeks to continue through Mearsheimer and Walt's book and continue this series on this very powerful relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Thanks to everyone. And I don't have any cool show outro this week, so I'll just say bye and end the stream. see you guys next time.